Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to Elite Performance Solutions Professional Development Series on Pushing the Boundaries of Achievement. My name is Kim Vernon, and I work with the co-founders of Elite Performance Solutions, Steve Miller and Tom Nugent. And we're so glad that you're here with us today. This session is being recorded, so we will be able to share this with you afterwards. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Just want to thank all of you for joining us today, along with our international partners. And you can see the logos here, and they're also part of our panel today. We have BrainFit from Singapore and Stronger Brains from here in California, LearnFast Australia, and Brain Maps in Shanghai. And we'll go ahead and get started. And I'd like to welcome David Rabiner. And David, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Sure. Thank you, Kim. Good morning or good evening, everybody. It's morning here back in North Carolina. My name is David Rabiner. I'm a clinical psychologist, a research professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University, where I also work as an academic dean for, spent about 20 years or so with colleagues, a number of colleagues at Duke and elsewhere, doing research on ADHD, and I got particularly interested in the role of attention difficulties in children's academic achievement, and that's what we'll be talking about this today. So I sort of got interested in this question of how attention and achievement after reading a pretty prominent review paper that Steve Hinshaw wrote back in 1992, looking at the role of externalizing difficulties more broadly on academic underachievement. And he summarized the body of work that existed at that time, and the main conclusion was that inattention and hyperactivity, the core symptoms of ADHD, were clearly linked to reading underachievement in early and middle childhood. However, at the time, the research was limited in the sense that the kinds of longitudinal studies in which children with attention difficulties are followed over time, where you are controlling for appropriate factors like IQ, socioeconomic status, those kinds of studies weren't yet done. And as a result, you really couldn't make any kind of causal inferences about what was actually causing children to achieve at a level below which they should have been capable of. And also, externalizing problems are broad. They include attention problems, hyperactivity, oppositional behavior, and the research hadn't really teased apart yet which aspects of externalizing problems are most directly linked to problems in academic performance, which is an important thing to know about if your goal is to really enhance children's academic performance and achievement. Next slide. So I'm going to speak briefly this morning about 3 studies that we did on this issue. The first is a simple, straightforward sort of correlational study looking at the relationship between attention problems and academic achievement in 3 main areas. The second is actually a much more sophisticated study that looks at the predictive relationship between early attention problems and academic achievement, specifically in reading. And the third, I think, is a pretty interesting study that looks at how the presence of attention problems for a child, whether that sort of moderates the impact of traditional academic interventions like tutoring. We'll start with the first study. So in this study, this is based on a sample of over 600 first grade students from elementary schools in Durham, North Carolina, which is where Duke University is located. You can see the demographic breakdown of the participants that reflect the population of the schools where we did the study. Next slide. And so, yeah, this was a really simple correlational study. We had teachers rate students' academic achievement in reading, math, and written language from far below grade level to far above grade level. They made those ratings at the end of the school year, at the end of the first grade. They also completed the Connors rating scale on each student. The Connors is probably the most widely used rating scale to assess ADHD symptoms along with some other behavioral problems. And we identified students in this sample as being inattentive if their standard score on essentially the inattentive scale on the Connors was greater than 1.0. Essentially what that means is students who are in the top 15% of the sample for teacher-rated attention problems were considered our inattentive group, and if everybody else was just in our kind of normal group. You can see we had 86 children who are in our inattentive group. And what I want to stress is some of those kids certainly would have qualified for diagnosis of ADHD if a full assessment were done, but many were not. So many had attention problems that did not necessarily rise to the level that you'd expect to see in a child with a true ADHD diagnosis. Next slide. And those are just, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, just the inattentive symptoms of ADHD. There are 9 of them, and I won't read through those. You can just skip ahead to the next slide. Okay, so here's basically what we found. So the blue bars show the percentage of students in the inattentive group. Again, these were students who were in the top 15% of that sample for teacher ratings of attention problems. Shows the percent of those students who were rated below grade level at the end of the year by their teacher in reading, in math, and in writing, in written language. And the red bars show the percentage of all the other students, the students without high levels of attention problems who were rated below grade level in those areas. And you can see there's an enormous difference. 3 to 4 times more of the inattentive group were seen as below grade level by their teachers than students without those higher levels of attention problems. Now, this is cross-sectional, it's correlational. We're not controlling for things like IQ, for other kinds of behavior problems. And that's where the next study does a much better job of kind of really documenting the importance of attention. So the second study is really looking at the predictive association between attention problems and reading achievement or reading difficulties. And there are a couple of different obvious causal pathways. One is that early attention problems lead to the development of reading difficulties. So a student begins school, for whatever reason, they have a hard time focusing and attending as kind of those basic foundational skills in reading are being taught. As a result, they don't catch on in the way that they otherwise would. And not surprisingly, if they don't learn those foundational skills, phonetic decoding, etc., then their reading achievement suffers over time. And then another sort of plausible pathway is if students begin school already behind in the development of their kind of early literacy skills. So some student starts first grade and they're just behind their classmates in the building blocks of early literacy, then you can imagine that they struggle, they get frustrated, and we've all seen kids who kind of start to tune out when they're having a hard time picking things up. And so it's plausible that early challenges with reading and early literacy skills can actually promote the development of inattentive behavior as students withdraw from an activity where they're struggling. Next slide. So in this study, it's called the Fast Track study. It was actually a huge undertaking in 4 different communities around the US. I won't go into the details about what what the study was all about. But for our purpose here, we followed nearly 400 children from kindergarten through the end of 5th grade. And we had measures of their reading achievement using the Woodcock-Johnson, which is a widely used standardized measure of academic achievement. And we had measures of their reading achievement after kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 5th grade. And then we had teacher ratings, not just of attention problems, but also of hyperactivity, internalizing difficulties, which are kind of depression, anxiety, externalizing problems, oppositional behavior, and we obtained those teacher ratings at similar points in time. Next slide.
David, can I just pause for 1 second just to let people know that if they want to write in the Q&A part, we can address open questions that they have, but we won't be taking any questions with raised or lowered hands until we're finished. Okay, so sorry about that. Continue, please.
Yeah, so this slide is a bit hard to follow, so let me just kind of walk through it. And what we're looking at here is the predictive relationship between attention difficulties and reading achievement over time. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is that the reason you don't see any boxes on there for hyperactivity, for internalizing difficulties, which again are sort of depression and anxiety, or for broader externalizing problems like oppositional behavior, is because none of those things mattered. They had no impact on the development of children's reading skills after you take into account their IQ and their levels of attention difficulties. So if we start with that kindergarten inattention box, you can see there's an arrow that goes to kindergarten reading. That would be their reading achievement score on the Woodcock-Johnson at the end of kindergarten. You see that negative sign, which means that the higher ratings that they received from their teacher for attention difficulties during kindergarten, the lower their reading achievement score was at the end of kindergarten. And that's taking into account what their IQ score was. It's also taking into account the hyperactivity ratings and the other kinds of behavior problems ratings, which just didn't seem to make a difference. What you can then see is if you look at the path between kindergarten reading and 1st grade inattention, you can see that there's a negative relationship there, which means that children who had higher reading scores at the end of kindergarten demonstrated lower attention problems during 1st grade. So there's a little bit of evidence there for the pathway from reading problems to attention difficulties. But then what you see is if you look at the path between attention problems in 1st grade and reading at the end of 1st grade, again, you see another negative relationship, which means that children who showed higher levels of inattention in 1st grade also had lower reading achievement at the end of 1st grade. And what's important to emphasize is that's indicating that attention problems in 1st grade are associated with reduced rates of reading skill at the end of 1st grade, even if you're taking into account children's IQ, and you're also taking into account their reading skills at the beginning of the year. So controlling for things like IQ, controlling for prior reading, attention difficulties during 1st grade predict lower levels of reading achievement. And this study was really the first longitudinal study that clearly demonstrated that taking into account things like IQ, socioeconomic status, other kinds of behavior problems, it's really just attention that is driving reductions in children's reading achievement. IQ is important. Socioeconomic status is important. We don't have it on here, but other kinds of behavior problems that often go along with academic difficulties, hyperactivity, oppositional behavior. Teachers know that many times children who demonstrate those behaviors are also struggling academically, and it's easy to kind of assume that they're playing some kind of causal role. The reason they show a relationship with academic problems is because they tend to be associated with attention problems. Those things go together. But once you tease out the unique role of attention problems, those other things don't seem to matter at all, period. They just don't, at least not at this early level, okay? And then let's go to the next slide, Kim. We also looked in this sample at sort of the consequences of, quote, serious attention problems and serious early reading difficulties. So what we did is we looked at, okay, how does reading achievement change between the end of kindergarten and the end of first grade for children who have high levels of attention problems during first grade? And by high levels, again, we're defining that as being in the top 15% of the sample. And we had 57 children in our sample who were considered highly inattentive by that criteria. And what you can see is that the reading achievement score using the same Woodcock-Johnson measure declined between end of kindergarten and end of first grade for 43 out of those 57 children. The average score declined. You can see there, it's about a third of a standard deviation, a significant decline. And then go to the next slide, Kim. The reverse was not true. So we also looked at what happens to the change in attention problems for students who begin first grade with early literacy deficits. So what we did there is we looked at children who entered first grade in the bottom 15% of early reading skills based on the assessment conducted after kindergarten. There were 37 of those students, and we looked at what happens to their rating of attention problems between kindergarten and first grade. And you can see there, it's kind of 50-50. So for 20 of those 37 students, their attention problems went up during the first grade year, but they declined for about an equal number. The average didn't change much. It was a non-significant increase. So the data are suggesting much more strongly that it's attention difficulties that lead to reading problems, and we had little evidence for the reverse, that reading problems lead to increase in attention difficulties. Okay, next slide. And then because this was a very well-funded, millions and millions of dollars, the main investigators of the study were actually able to follow this sample through high school into young adulthood. So this is a real longitudinal study where kids are tracked from kindergarten through their mid-20s. They're actually still following those participants who are now, I think, in their late 30s. And what we found when we looked at this longer-term educational performance and attainment is we saw that attention problems in first grade, they predicted lower reading achievement scores at the end of fifth grade. First grade attention problems predicted lower grades in fifth grade in all areas, in reading and math and science, in social studies. And again, this is controlling for things like IQ and SES, okay, and hyperactivity. The magnitude of the effects, the adverse effects of early attention difficulties on academic achievement was of similar magnitude to what we found for IQ and for socioeconomic status. So the magnitude of the, quote, the harm that attention problems in this sample exerted on children's academic performance and achievement was similar to what you see associated with IQ and with children who are coming from more adverse socioeconomic backgrounds. Furthermore, we found that attention problems in first grade actually significantly reduced the odds of high school graduation. So taking into account these other factors, it's really quite remarkable. Children who were a standard deviation above the mean on attention problems in first grade, so that's the top 15% of the sample, were about 40% less likely to graduate from high school. That's what we found. Next slide. Okay, so then, got interested, given this important role of early attention problems on achievement, the kinds of academic interventions that are typically done, things like tutoring, how does, or is there evidence that attention problems kind of reduces the benefits of the kinds of interventions that schools are typically doing? So in this study, we looked at two basic questions. Do attention problems moderate, change the impact of tutoring? And in particular, how do attention problems impact the effects of tutoring on children who really need it the most, which are children who are really struggling in their early reading skills? Next slide. So for this study, 581 children who were from the intervention and control groups within this larger fast track study. Children in the intervention sample here, they received 90 minutes a week, an hour and a half, 3 30-minute sessions of individual phonics-based reading tutoring over the entire first grade. So that's a pretty hefty dose of individualized intervention. Next slide, Kim. And again, we had measures of their reading achievement after kindergarten and after first grade. We also had ratings of their attention problems in the spring of first grade. Like before, we had ratings of other behavioral problems. We also had IQ estimates on these students. Next slide. Oh, so there's a slide that got removed. So I have to first talk about the groups that were created. We created 3 groups of participants. So we had children. We had one group of kids who had. Let me just find my slide here. Oh, it's gone. We had one group of students who had early reading problems, which means that they were in the bottom 15% on the development of their early literacy skills as they began first grade using the standardized Woodcock-Johnson measure of achievement. So they had early reading problems. They did not have attention problems according to their teacher ratings, and they received this tutoring intervention. Oh, you know what? I'm confusing myself. We're going to get to that part next. This slide shows the y-axis, the vertical axis shows their standardized reading achievement score at the end of first grade. And the x-axis shows their standardized attention problem score based on their teacher ratings during first grade. And the solid line are the students who received the intervention, the individualized reading instruction, and the dotted line is the control group. They got no tutoring and reading during the year. And what this shows at this -1, that's low levels of attention problems. Those are kids who are in the bottom 15% in teacher ratings of attention difficulties. And what you can see is at low levels of attention problems, the tutoring really seems to make a difference. So the average score for children in the control group was a standard score of 0. For children who got the tutoring, it's about 0.5. That's about, tutoring was associated with about a half a standard deviation gain in reading achievement during at the end of the year. And what you can see as attention problems increase and move over to this standard score of 1. So these are now kids who are in the top 15%. They have high levels of attention problems. You can see that there's essentially no difference between the tutoring group and the control group. So as attention problems increase, as we move from left to right on this attention problems axis, the impact of tutoring consistently declines to the point where when you get to high rates of attention problems, there was no evidence that 90 minutes a week of individual tutoring made any difference at all. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is even more striking. This is where I got ahead of myself. So we divided the sample up into groups. So in group 1, we have children with early reading problems. So these are kids who begin first grade in the bottom 15% of their early literacy skills, but they don't show problems with attention during the year, and they get the tutoring. In group 2, they have the same level of early reading difficulties at the start of first grade. They also don't show high levels of attention problems, but they don't receive any tutoring. So they're kind of the controls. And then in group 3, we have children who also have early reading problems at the same level, but they also have attention problems according to their teacher ratings. So they have high levels of early reading difficulties, high levels of attention problems during the year, but they get the tutoring. They get the same 90 minutes a week of tutoring. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, click the first button for me. Okay, so what this shows, the x-axis, the y-axis shows the standard score in reading achievement at the end of first grade for children. This first group is the group of kids with early reading problems, no attention problems, who got the tutoring. And what I need to explain is this is going from a -1 up to a standard score of 0. A standard score of 0 means that's average. Kids are at the mean. That's where you want them to be. They're like at the 50th percentile of reading achievement. So they would have started down here below -1 because that's how they were defined. They had high levels of early reading difficulty. So for those kids with early reading problems, no attention problems, who get tutoring, the tutoring makes a huge difference. I mean, they improved by about a full standard deviation during the year. That is a lot. I mean, that is showing that for kids who have reading problems alone, but who are not inattentive, this kind of phonics-based individualized tutoring just allowed them to catch up. By the end of the year, they were where they should be. Hit the click again, Kim. Okay, now these are the second group. These are children who had comparable levels of early reading difficulties to the first group. They did not have attention problems, and they did not get any tutoring. And you can see at the end of the year, they're basically, in terms of their reading scores, where they started out. They didn't get better. They didn't catch up. Okay, that's kind of what you'd expect. It's showing that if you have kids with early reading problems, if you tutor them, they get better. If you don't tutor them in the normal course of first grade instruction, they didn't make any relative gains compared to their peers. They didn't get closer to where they needed to be. And then here's the bar that, click again. This was shocking to me when we found this. I mean, this was one of the most surprising and in some ways disappointing findings of any work that I've been associated with. What this shows is that children who had started out with the same level of reading problems, no more, but who were also struggled with attention in first grade, okay? They were highly inattentive according to their teachers, but they got the same tutoring. These kids got the same 90 minutes a week of individualized tutoring and reading. They made no progress. They're exactly comparable statistically to group 2. So what we have demonstrated there, unfortunately, is that if poor readers who are also inattentive, there's no evidence that tutoring helped them at all, even though it was a tremendous benefit to poor readers who were not also inattentive. So none of us involved in this study expected to find that. What we expected to find is that individualized tutoring would allow them to make significant gains, and that then we could argue for the importance of screening young kids for early attention difficulties, and then intervening in this kind of way to allow them to end their first grade year where they needed to be and sort of change their educational trajectory, but it didn't happen because attention problems completely wiped out the benefits of tutoring. So last slide. We've done other work related to this, and there are labs around the world that have looked at this issue, and this is really a consistent body of findings. So the main conclusions are that early attention difficulties have a long-term adverse effect on academic achievement, and they have a unique adverse effect. It's not hyperactivity, it's not oppositional behavior. Those things that look like they also lead to academic problems, it's because they tend to go along with attention difficulties, but they're not making a unique contribution on their own. It's important to note that the adverse impact of attention on achievement, it occurs even when those attention problems don't necessarily rise to a level seen in kids with ADHD. A lot of the kids in our sample that we're calling highly inattentive would not have been kids who would have, whose level of attention difficulties would have resulted in an ADHD diagnosis. The other thing, which as a conclusion from the last study, is it looks like, at least some traditional interventions like tutoring, which is probably the most widely used academic intervention in schools, they're just less effective for children who have early attention problems in addition to their academic struggles. Our study suggests they don't really work at all. That's just one study, but there hasn't been another study on that topic that's been done. And it was really the results of that study that led me to get really interested in interventions to improve attention skills. One conclusion to draw from that third study is it's not just enough when children have attention problems that go along with academic struggles to work on the academic struggles. There may really need to be efforts made to directly improve and enhance their ability to focus and attend. And at the time when we did this work, there was very, very little out there in the literature on ways that children could potentially practice and improve their attention. Is attention a skill like other skills that can improve with practice? So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, David. That was wonderful. We're going to open this up to our panel discussion, and then also open it up for people who have questions. So just to kind of let you know the layout here, we want to have our panelists introduce themselves and ask you any questions, David, and start a conversation going. And then we will open it up to our attendees to see if they have any questions. Again, if you want to post your questions in the Q&A section of this webinar, please do so. We do have Steve and Tom responding. And let's go ahead and get started. So we'll have, if our panelists can introduce themselves. Cheryl, why don't you go ahead and go first?
Yeah, thank you, Kim, Dr. David Rabiner. That was really interesting research that you were sharing, and I thought I was equally astounded, when I saw that group of children with attention challenges receiving tutoring, had no impact on them. My question is, we're seeing a lot, and hearing from parents that children are having shorter and shorter attention span. So as you have mentioned, they may not necessarily be in the diagnostic range of having ADD or ADHD. So are you aware, of any studies that have really, measured the attention span of children and whether that truly is declining, just whether there's any, objective data around that. And of course, I think we have lots of parents and teachers in the audience, to hear some of your recommendations and advice, for parents and teachers who might be having inattentive kids, not necessarily with ADD or ADHD, but certainly, being inattentive, when studying or at school.
Yeah, So, this becomes kind of one of the times where it's the answers are always disappointing in some ways. So so no, I'm not aware of there may be, and I may just not be aware of it, but I'm not aware of kind of objective data that sort of looked at that can really address the question, is there actually an objective decline in children's ability to focus and attend between, say, what it is currently and 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I just don't know if data related to that has ever been collected. There's certainly, lots of anecdotal reports that with all the screen time and the distractions that children's attention ability to focus and attend, not just kids, but our own, has declined. But in terms of data sets that have been put together to look at that, I'm not aware of it. In terms of what to do, I have to say that when we, and I'm coming at it from the perspective of a researcher, not somebody who works in the classroom with kids, but when we did our work, so following the research that I just described, I got really interested in the prospects of training attention, and got some funding to do an attention training study using computerized attention training methods. And when we did this study, this would have been back in 2005 or so. If you looked in the research literature for studies that address the simple question, is attention a skill that children can improve with practice, there was essentially nothing on that. I mean, there were a handful of what you would consider pilot studies, small sample kinds of studies. There's been more work that's been done in the last decade or so, but it's still an open question. I think that most researchers in the field would say that at this point, evidence that attention training can really make a meaningful difference. There's lots of promising work that's been done. There's a lot of work in the neurofeedback field that I think has the strongest evidence that neurofeedback is something that can improve attention skills. But there's I would say still a long way to go, and in particular to develop interventions that can be brought into the classroom, right, in a practical way. That's a whole nother challenge. I mean, it's one thing to be able to demonstrate something in a university research grant funded study, but to take something and bring it to scale out in the educational world is a whole nother issue. Lot to be done there.
Thank you.
David, if I can, having a flick through a couple of questions there, I know a few people in the audience have also been curious. Is there a gender bias? And is that gender bias more prominent at the younger age groups, at the older primary, as adults? What's the impact of gender? And is there different types of attention or inattention showing up across the genders?
I think I don't know if I'd call it a gender bias per se, but there is research that shows that at least in terms of children with ADHD, that it's the inattentive type that tends to be more prominent among girls. That girls are less likely than boys to demonstrate high levels of hyperactive and impulsive behavior. That can be a part of ADHD, but seems to be so less often for young girls. As a result, there are concerns that that girls who struggle with attention may be more likely to to be missed, to sort of fall through the cracks, because they're less likely to be the kinds of, candidly hyperactive behavior problems that immediately capture teachers and parents' attention. So they may not be identified as early. There's no evidence at all that the impact of attention problems is any different between the genders. So if, in our work, we look to see, does gender influence the relationships that we found between attention problems and achievement, and it doesn't. It works similarly in girls and in boys.
Right, thank you.
Dude, I'm curious. Any particular features about inattentive ADHD that seem to be more predictive of later problems, such as sustained attention, initial focus, selective attention? Are there any features?
Yeah, so if you think back to that list that I presented earlier, there are 9 inattentive symptoms of ADHD, and there hasn't really been a lot of work looking at the kind of what is the prediction from individual symptoms to the kinds of problems that I was talking about. To the extent that it's been done, I think, and intuitively it makes sense, is that what's likely, or what may be the most important aspect of attention on academics is sustained attention and sustained kind of mental effort. And particularly, that's why it's kind of interesting. So I teach at Duke, and there are students who arrive at Duke, and Duke is a tough school to get into. So everybody there has had a history of pretty high levels of academic success. And there are some students who get here and they just kind of hit a wall. It's because as the demands, and this happens over of course, starting way earlier than college, but the further along kids go in school, the greater the demands for sustained attention become, because the work gets harder, the assignments get longer, and so in particular, it's not uncommon, and clinicians will recognize this. You can have bright, inattentive kids who do fine, or certainly get by in the early years, when their intellectual ability, they're able to compensate for their struggles with attention because the academic demands are less pronounced. But then they get into middle and high school, where the demands get greater, the organizational demands get greater, and it looks like all of a sudden they've kind of fallen apart, when in reality they've had those struggles all along, but they've been able to do okay because they were quite bright. And that happens to some of our students in college, where they actually did okay in high school because they were so capable, but they get to a place where they're with a group of peers who are equally capable, and the demands are really pretty extreme in some ways, and then their attention skills don't serve them well, and they struggle.
Nice.
David, so first of all, thank you, Dr. Rabiner. Really enjoyed the presentation, and we received a lot of questions that'll take some time for us to provide some written responses to. One of the questions that came up was, so first of all, if you could just address kind of how does classification work? Like, are the classification systems are standardized, but how do they work? Because people want to relate what you're calling ADHD to what they might have it called, et cetera. So if you can comment on what DSM are and kind of the classification schemes that are out there, number one. And then number two is, could you just address some of the literature about whether individuals who are medicated are more or less effective in receiving that as one of the interventions?
Yeah, okay. So I guess I should just start by just being clear that the data that I presented today was not was not based on diagnostic categories at all. So, you know, what we use to identify children with attention problems is teachers rated children on the symptoms of ADHD, on the inattentive symptoms of ADHD, but that's not a diagnosis. I mean, that, you know, teacher rating scales are one part of a comprehensive evaluation, but they're not a diagnosis. So we're just treating attention problems as kind of a continuous measure. You know, you've got a distribution of scores, and scores at the high end where just at some point saying, okay, we're going to consider everybody above this to be inattentive. A diagnosis of ADHD based on DSM criteria is a whole different matter, and you know, children have to show a certain number of symptoms. They have to show those symptoms in multiple settings. Those symptoms have to impair their functioning in significant ways, and you know, that's a diagnosis that's arrived at by a combination of a developmental history, interview with the parents and child, feedback from teachers, in some cases testing that's part of it. So you know, in the U.S. we use the DSM, and other parts of the world they use the ICD system, but that's not what we did. We didn't diagnose any kids in our study. Some of them probably had diagnoses, but if they did, we didn't know about it. What was the second part of your question?
Yeah, so first, and the test that you used, the survey that you used, is kind of the standard out there for predicting whether or not, if they were assessed, whether or not they would identify as probably being at risk for having an ADHD diagnosis if diagnosed.
Yeah, we used the Connor Teacher Rating Scale, which is it's at least in the U.S. I don't know about other countries. It's the most widely used behavior rating scale that clinicians would use when they're assessing kids for ADHD. But it's just part of an assessment. You can't diagnose a child based on rating scale data alone. It's a building block of a diagnostic eval. But yes, what we used is sort of the gold standard that's used in diagnostic evaluations.
And then the second question was just the role of medication.
Oh, yeah. So, you know, it's interesting. You would think after all the, you know, ADHD, and so now I'll switch to talking about ADHD specifically, is far and away the most widely researched diagnosis in child psychiatry and psychology. I mean, by far. God knows how many thousands of studies have been done. But, you know, there's actually surprisingly little data on, there's a ton of data on the impact of well-conducted medication treatment on the core symptoms of ADHD. So undoubtedly, you know, the majority of children with ADHD show significant reductions in attention difficulties and hyperactivity in response to well-conducted medication. That's been shown in hundreds or more, thousands of placebo-controlled studies. There's actually much less data, and it's because it's just harder to do. You know, it's hard to do these longitudinal studies that really demonstrates that medication treatment promotes better academic success over time. To the extent that that data exists, I would say, you know, there have been some research summaries that have been published in the last 4 or 5 years that suggests that medication treatment is associated with better academic outcomes, with better long-term academic outcomes, that being treated is better than not being treated. But you know, considering how long ADHD has been around and been studied, there's actually less evidence on that question than you might expect. And again, in part, it's because it's just really hard to do those studies. I mean, to put together those data sets, you're talking about following a sample of people over multiple years, which is just tough to do. But I would say the evidence that does exist would argue that medication treatment does make a difference, not just in academic functioning, but in other aspects as well, long term.
Great, thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, and we can see if we can open this up to see if any participants would like to ask any questions, or if our panelists want to continue asking questions, that's fine too. We appreciate your time, Dr. Rabiner. This is so valuable, and so I want to make sure people feel they have their questions answered. Again, please put them in the Q&A. I see we're getting lots of questions there, so we will get back to you as soon as we can. It may not be within this time frame, but we will definitely be getting back to you as well.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead see if we're able to open this to any other questions.
So, David, this is Tom Nugent here. Thanks for sharing your work. Really appreciate it. It was really informative. As a parent and looking through a lot of the questions, it seems like there's a lot of parents who immediately are thinking, how can we do something to help, right? And I think you touched upon this a little bit with the neurofeedback component, but I think it would be helpful if you dove into that a little bit more and talk about what are some of the remediation strategies and successful interventions out there for folks looking to help their children get over some of these attentional challenges. I think a couple minutes on that, but address a lot of the questions that are currently in the Q&A.
Yeah. So I guess, what I would say is, as I've read the literature at this point, what I think is the intervention that has the most research support in terms of improving children's ability to focus and attend is neurofeedback treatment. And I know you've got another webinar next week where my colleague Ed Hamlin, who's really one of the world's leading authorities on neurofeedback, teaches it all over the world, has done it for decades, is going to talk about that. But neurofeedback is basically an intervention where children or adults are hooked up to some kind of system that measures their EEG, their brainwave activity, and there are patterns of brainwave activity that are associated with a more focused, attentive state, and there are patterns of brainwave activity that are focused with a more daydreamy, non-alert state. And the basics of neurofeedback are that people receive real-time feedback on their brainwave activity. So I might be looking at a computer screen, and in this kind of a simplest application, there's like a smiley face on the screen. And when I'm producing the pattern, when I'm really focused on that thing and my attention is focused on what's in front of me, and my brainwave activity reflects the kind of activity that you see when people are focused and attentive, I see that because the smile gets bigger. When I start to think about not what's in front of me, but, oh, what am I going to have for dinner? And I'm now kind of getting lost in my thoughts. That's reflected in changes in my brainwave activity that reflect a more non-alert, daydreaming state. And I see that, I get feedback on that because the smile starts to go away. And there's, at this point, I think, I read a lot of compelling evidence that if people practice, over time, learning to produce the kind of brainwave activity that signifies that kind of focused, attentive, alert state, they get better at being able to do that. And at this point, my read of the literature is that neurofeedback is an effective intervention for increasing attention skills. It's got more research support than other kinds of attention training things that are out there, that at least that are out there in the peer-reviewed scientific literature.
And the only thing I would add is, as David's aware, we're working with some of the partners who are on this call to contribute in that area as well. But we'll be trying to share some of those elements across the series of talks more than just today. So Dr. Rabner's kind of whetting the appetite for more discussion about intervention. And that's great. I will say, so just, we have dozens of questions, great questions. The other question, David, we probably have time for just one more, is about subtypes. Are there useful subtypes out there that tell us about, resilience or resistance to intervention or long-term better outcomes, or things that show up in adult age groups more than in children, or anything that you can speak about subtypes or where people might look for them?
Yeah, I mean, there are three subtypes of ADHD, right? There's the inattentive type, and those are children who show high levels of the inattentive symptoms, but not high levels of hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And then there's the hyperactive impulsive subtype, which is just the opposite, high rates of hyperactivity and impulsivity, but less problems with attention. And then there's the combined subtype, which shows high levels of both, both types of symptoms. In terms of academic outcomes, it's the inattentive kids, and it's the combined kids who have also high levels of attention problems who do worse. It just is. I mean, there have actually, been some studies that have shown that, academic issues among the hyperactive impulsive subtype aren't nearly there to the same extent. I mean, we actually, surprisingly, in some ways, found evidence in our data, really that, again, once you controlled for attention problems, hyperactivity was not associated in any adverse way with academics. The other thing that's really important, I think, for parents to be aware of in terms of long-term outcomes for ADHD is, yes, ADHD has a direct negative adverse impact on academic functioning. That's what, that's kind of what my talk this morning was all about. And it's the attention problems that drive that. But in terms of what drives not just the academic stuff, but the other kinds of challenges that many kids with ADHD have, the peer difficulties, there are higher rates long-term of substance use, of unemployment, all kinds of things. It's not necessarily the ADHD per se, but it's the kinds of things that often go along with ADHD. So kids with ADHD are at higher risk for developing serious problems with oppositional behavior, serious conduct problems. They're at higher risk for internalizing problems. And those are the kinds of things that good intervention, can help to stave off. So if I've got a kid with ADHD, if I can, through my own parenting, through my work with professionals when needed, if I can prevent the development of those co-occurring problems, which good treatment and good intervention can do. So, I just have straightforward ADHD, but I don't also become oppositional. I don't develop challenges with substance use. I don't get into a kind of a bad group of peers because I'm rejected or disliked by the more mainstream peers. My outcomes can be pretty darn good. People tend to mix up ADHD with everything that oftentimes goes along with it, because those other problems are unfortunately relatively common in kids with ADHD. But it's those other problems that often develop in response to some of the challenges that ADHD creates that in my view, and in the view of many others, drives the most serious kinds of long-term adverse effects. And if you can keep those things from developing, your child is just going to be should be in much, much, much better shape.
Great. Well, thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. We're almost at the top of the hour, and again, we see lots of questions in the Q&A. We will get back to those of you who posted those as soon as we can. We just want to thank you again for joining us, not only our attendees but also our panel. And just want to let you know that yes, next week we do have another session as part of our series with Dr. Ed Hamlin, talking about the basics of EEG, neurofeedback practice, and science. So please check with your international partners and as well as our website to find out more about that. That will be session 2.
Yeah, let me just put a little plug for that. So, Ed is probably, he could conceivably be the most experienced neurofeedback practitioner and trainer in the world. He's done this for decades. And so, the talk that I gave today really sort of in some ways laid the foundation for highlighting how important it is to address problems with attention in terms of academic achievement. In Ed's talk and Dr. Hamlin's talk, he'll talk about this one approach to improving attention that, as I said, at least as I read the literature at this point, has the strongest research base for indicating that it actually does make a difference. So I'd really encourage you to be there for Dr. Hamlin's talk next week if you can.
Great.
Rabiner. And again, thank you to our international partners. Apologies, this slide got a little off. But again, as part of our panel, we have Cheryl Chia, who is with BrainFit in Singapore, and we have Dave from LearnFast in Australia, as well as Alex and Stronger Brains here in California. So again, thank you so much. We could not have done this without them. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your interest and your time. And if you have additional questions, please let us know.